oh, is there a Brussels effect? Who is the winner with what standard? I think that's not the question here. The question is, what standard makes most sense, for everybody? Just leaving aside, where it's coming from and how can it be used in a way that it's not too confusing. But I think, that's something where I see some. Some people think it's great. Some people think it's way too black and white. We'll have to see, but it's in the effort to make the online sphere a fairer world. And so that is obviously something that plays a lot into sustainability reflections and the digital transformation. Wow, so that's what I wanted to say about digital regulation.
I want to maybe ask a little bit of questions around exactly what you said. And
yes, of course.
We can spend the next half an hour just asking questions, but I'll ask only 2 or 3. First, I'll start to mention our really focus also on AI and digital transformation. And you might know, but Isabella actually published her first book, her bestseller, called The Digital Mind of Tomorrow. And we call her a social futurist because she's looking at the impact of AI really beyond the current frameworks and regulations and so on that you so well
really interesting.
And I should mention here that your career spans the 2 continents and some islands, the British Islands being. And I have a question about how do you see, for instance, equivalence? Because in regulations, especially for multinationals, you mentioned Amazon and Google and so on, it's hard for them to navigate in different regions and so on. There are mostly, I think, they are domiciled in the US companies. You already mentioned that these companies have to be, because of their large presence in Europe, either directly or through supply chain, they have to be also subject to European law. So if you have any thoughts on that, I know you teaching also in the US as a visiting professor, so maybe you can comment a little bit.
Of course. So there are people who say there is something called the Brussels effect. I'm not sure, looking at digital transformation and digital regulation in the US, for example, also in the UK, I wouldn't say that is necessarily true. So in the digital sphere, we see a scattered landscape when it comes to things like platforms, regulation of platforms, and how we do this. So in the UK, there's a forthcoming bill about this, but it's more, I'd say, more the common law approach. So no regulation in the fine detail, but like just a larger, like a code of conduct approach, which can be adapted. And so I would say, obviously, if you want to do business in EU, then this is the standard. So there isn't something that companies can do about this, because so the law is really, it doesn't look at where are you based, it looks at where you provide your services. So looking at digital laws, if it has an impact on someone who's based in the EU, and that doesn't have to be an EU citizen in general terms, it is just sufficient. So some of my students here in Europe are from the US. They are making claims under the GDPR, and they find it fascinating, to hold certain companies accountable. So because they're covered by EU legislation. So that is, what you see. And I don't think that equivalence, I mean, in digital transformation, it really depends on where your users are. When it comes to reporting, so again, I'm very often being asked, what about the ESSB standard against the ethics standard in sustainability matters? And I can just say, I advise my clients, wherever they're based, to comply with the European standard because it's a double materiality standard. In that sense, is already wider. And if you report against the wider standard, then you will definitely be covered by the not so wide standard. So it makes sense to adopt the wider standard, especially as we've discussed. It's not only about complying with the law, it's how do you attract investors? And if you want to attract investors, it's not only, it's also about what does your, investor, what do consumers look at? They want to have the clearest information possible on your impact on the environment, your business's impact on the environment, social and governance. So that's what consumers want. And you will have seen Shell being, brought to court by Client Earth now. So it's also a matter of protecting your business, because you don't want to make a claim which then leads to collective redress action somewhere in the world. So I would say the strongest standard should be the one that makes your business safe and robust, even though it might look like an enormous struggle at the outset. And that's, I think, where many of my clients find it very difficult to find the entry into the topic. But once you have found your way and you have a strategy as to what data you have, what data you need, what data needs to be improved, you can base your business strategy on that. And that's not only to comply with forthcoming legislation or existing legislation and making you attractive around the globe, or to attract investment, like further thinking, think about your buyers, your consumers, think about the workforce. So this is something, where companies need to think more long-term instead of short-term profit. They need to think, what brings me long-term profit? And the long-term profit is if you provide significant harm to some of the those aspects, like whether it's in the environmental sphere or social or governance, it's going to make a huge negative impact on your business.
You use also the term double materiality. We're just grasping the simple materiality. Would you be able to give us a little bit more context?
Of course, yes, with pleasure. So double materiality, there are always two ways of looking at data and business, and like the impact of business on the environment and vice versa. So there's an outward looking standard, which is saying, so what's the impact of your business on the environment, on human rights? What's that impact? And then that's the traditional standard, I would call it, is more like, what's the impact of developments in the environment, climate change, for example? What's the impact of this on your company and how you're doing financially? So this is and the double materiality standard combines these two. So the double materiality standard says, okay, so looking at the climate, how robust is your company, facing these risks of climate change? That's, the impact of the outer world onto your business, especially financially. And then the other one, which is, again, so the other side of the coin, which is quite where the EU has quite a focus on, is what's the impact of your business on the outside world? So that's double materiality, because double materiality just means you will have to have a good story for both, not only for one. It's not sufficient to say, oh, I'm robust, no problem for me, climate change, my cars will run. But it's also, what are the emissions of your cars on the environment? Like how are you, polluting the globe with what you're producing, whether it's how you're producing it, or whether it's the end product, or whether it's end of life cycle, how you get rid of it. So this is also something that we need to consider. It really looks at every stage of the production. So from how do you produce your stuff, or how do you produce the services you provide? But obviously, we think mostly about products. How do you produce them? Is that environmentally friendly? To stick with environment for a moment. And then what you're producing does this have an impact on the environment? And once it's over, it has seen its best years, how can it be, decomposed? So this is all part of the story. So it's very wide ranging. And again, I think that we need to be realistic here. Nobody is helped with the short term. You're not saying that anyone is short term. I myself in two minds as to what extent everything needs to be over-regulated. But I think the approach of taking into account both sides of the coin makes absolute sense.
That's clear. Actually, on one of the courses I instruct in Cornell, there is a discussion around the shareholder primacy, the Friedmans edict, which is about 50 years old, and still a lot of discussion on fiduciary duties, how board of directors, how executives have to act. They have to position the company around now learn term double materiality, but really trying to determine the long-term impact on the environment, on their operations. For instance, if the cost of inputs, water, electricity will go up because of environmental rules, they should consider it as part of their strategy. Either save, diversify, reduce the products that are the most prone to carbon emissions and so on. EVs will be an example.
Indeed. And also, I also wanted to briefly mention like upcoming laws. And as we will see, the trend really is to get more and more companies in scope. So, in other words, it's not even from a commercial point of view in the global world we live in, you want to comply with these standards already because you otherwise are being cut off of your supply chain, or at least you risk being cut off your supply chain. Because if you're not compliant with these rules and you're a supplier to someone who's based in the EU, with the upcoming legislation as well, which I'm going to mention as soon as you want me to, there is another obligation indirectly on companies globally to comply with the standard.
We also found, and before I go to the next question, I'm eager to listen to it. But before we go there, actually in AKFI, we are conducting a study, a white paper, trying to determine the gap between also the internal regulations concerning supply chain. So we find a lot of disparities between companies that should be actually aligned. Let's say Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola, or Walmart and the Target and Costco in the US. And they find significant disparities, significant gap, which actually makes the supply chain to sort of have to respond to even increasing numbers of internal regulations. But they still have to run compliance through them. And as you said, there are more than often threatened to be, terminated from the supply chain of these large multinational companies. And there are, puzzling how difficult it is to comply with all the requirements. The simplest one would be, or the most known one would be carbon footprint, would be the Scope 3 emissions, and essentially forces all the supply chain to keep track of their emissions up to,
Indeed.
A company somewhere in Africa that has probably no means to transmit even the information.
Indeed, yeah, that's exactly, I think the future music is exactly that, Manuel. So we need to cooperate to, because no one will be able to cut off the supply chain entirely. And that's also hopefully not the intention. But the intention is hopefully to get collaboration and cooperation between members of the supply chain, with someone taking the lead, because that someone is at the end of the value chain, or at least in the middle, and therefore has more responsibility than others. So that's
the Security and Exchange Commission even proposed a cost model for this kind of reporting. There is on the SEC side, but in the interest of time, and we love to have you back, because I don't think we'll finish everything in one session. But let's move to the next topic, please.
Yes, so the next topic, or Isabella, did you have a question? Or no?
Yeah, I guess as we, wrap up this conversation, always look forward to hear your insights, your thoughts on the future, looking at the crystal ball. Everyone is thinking about what might happen, these among all these uncertainties, unknowns. We're actually desperate to find some sort of guide or even answers. So in your opinion, what is the future for sustainability and the digital transformation?
Yes, good question. Thank you. I mean, before I come to that, maybe just to finish off on, I mean, we just looked a lot into reporting. And so what I briefly mentioned is there is a trend which started just last year to keep up with the other SDGs as well, and to look at the supply chain. So we just discussed it. So what's the supply chain due diligence? And there, obviously, we have. It's an interesting trend, because we're starting here from soft law, OECD guidance, which we're then making as hard law. So because the EU has included this into the draft corporate sustainability diligence directive, which is currently in the making. And if that comes to life, then we're going to have companies being liable, being liable for detecting risks for the environment and human rights in their supply chain, more or less up and downstream. That's at least if the parliament gets its way. And also to mitigate these and to end contracts where this cannot be mitigated. And so there is a lot, which also includes audits, and obviously will be part of the reporting as well. So there's a lot in the making, looking at the supply chain. And so that's where I'm a big fan of thinking, how can this, all this lead to an opportunity? And so we're looking at the future for sustainability and digital transformation. I think there is a lot we can do working together. And so digital transformation enables us just to do that, or should do. So if we're using the platforms, if we're using what's out there correctly, then this could lead, to collaboration, seamless collaboration around the globe, in, making ourselves waterproof, in finding the holes, in detecting what can be improved, without, and so that's an opportunity for me. It's an enormous opportunity how we could use digital platforms to our advantage. The unlucky thing, obviously, is that there are always, competing interests and competing, tendencies. So if we think of dark patterns, for example, what that means, most people will know, but it's like really interfaces that nudge us in a certain way when we're using the online sphere. So for example, if you want to leave a service and they say, oh, do you really want to leave? Do you really, really want to leave? All your friends are here. So these dark patterns, obviously, something, and this would be something, I guess, Isabella, you are highly knowledgeable of, but yeah, how do we use AI? How do we master AI to our advantage, to the advantage of human mankind, the globe, and not to the advantage of a few who hold control over these tools? And so, again, I think this requires a lot of, collaboration and cooperation and thinking, what's actually the best outcome we want to achieve? And that's not, oh, is there a Brussels effect? Who is the winner with what standard? I think that's not the question here. The question is, what standard makes most sense, for everybody? Just leaving aside, where it's coming from and how can it be used in a way that it's not too confusing. And I think, that's something where I see some pros and cons for the EU standard, for example. So the pro is it's like holistic. The con is it's very granular. And so I would wish that people come together and look at the standard, whatever standard, and say, okay, how can we use this together to our advantage? How can we use platforms with certain safeguards to connect people around the globe in an equal way, not in a, my supplier sits somewhere at the end of the world, and so here is the package, but really like try to get a connection, which will be, again, it's not Alice in Wonderland, it's exactly what's coming. So this will be a requirement that you get this connection. I mean, Manuel mentioned it. Scope 3 reporting is all about this. You don't have control over 80% of the data that you have to report on. So you will have to get in touch with your supply chain, and you also can't cut them off because otherwise there's no one left. And so that is, where I see how these tools will hopefully help us.
Alexandra,
I mean, ideally, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. As you go into that, sort of a technical question, but for instance, in the US, there are different frameworks and enforcing power between the Security and Exchange Commission, the Trade Commission, and so on. So a large number of companies are actually privately held. And the question I have is, are these legislations, for instance, supply chain due diligence applies also to private companies? Do you know if the act goes in that direction? Because, the supply chain is not homogeneous. It's not only public or privately traded.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's good that we mentioned the upcoming or probably upcoming CSDDD as well. So the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, because the CSRD, so the one about the reporting that just entered into force, that is very much about, are you listed? Yeah. So if you're not listed, it rather impacts on you indirectly. So you can be an SME, yeah, but
Right.
You must be listed. Yeah.
But if you are a supplier to a listed company, then you are subject
Exactly,
to the
that
same.
indirectly
Yeah.
you're still in scope. And this is where the CSDD comes in. Because, I mean, it comes in two ways under the CSRD, because reporting includes also, you know, it doesn't only include your business, but the greater scale. And the CSDD requires you to undertake due diligence within your supply chain. Whether that supply chain is publicly listed or not is completely irrelevant. So this is how these two fit together. It's actually really two limbs, the reporting and the due diligence, two limbs, but they are circular. And so in other words, whether you're private or not, you know, still makes you
Eventually,
part of the whole story.
eventually, yeah, you are there by association. I wasn't saying
Yes,
guilty, right? But you are
yes,
by association, you're part of it.
indeed.
When these legislations will come into power, or are they already into power?
Well, the CSDDD, so as so often with these types of legislation, there is so the two organs that make EU laws in the EU are normally the Council of the European Union, which is basically the ministers of the member states, and the European Parliament. And you will have very often you'll have the trend that the European Parliament is more social. It's also looking at this composition. There are many deputies, you know, from the Green Party, the Social Party, and so it's there is a trend within the EP to say, oh yes, it should be the whole supply chain. Board directors should be directly liable, and we include due diligence in the whole value chain, and so that's something that the ministers have gone against. And so where we are at the moment, when this happens, that the two organs are in disagreement, then they think a little bit, and then they enter into so-called trilogues, so negotiation meetings. And so the Council has already given its mandate, and the European Parliament is expected to do so formally in May. So probably we're not going to see this law being adopted before the summer break, but I'd say late 2023 or early 2024 probably. But again, it's not bad. It's actually rather good, and it's not, you know, it shouldn't give us or businesses the opportunity to lean back, because I think what is required under these laws requires a transformation of businesses. And that's not something that's being done from one day to the other. So it's actually good that, you know, there's a breather so that people can accurately prepare.
Right. No, transformation of business is a multi-year process. It's not, you know, I compare large businesses with large ships. You cannot turn them around, right? The Titanic saw the iceberg, but was too late.
Yeah, exactly. But yes, and that's exactly what I'm trying to, you know, explain to my clients. So is don't lean back. You know, it's not in your interest, but don't lean back. You start now, you know, because it's taking quite a while to get into the topic. Because it's all quite confusing at first sight, and there's still a lot under development, obviously. And people think, oh, if it's still under development, I'm just going to wait for it. But that's not how it works, because a lot of it has already been adopted. So whilst we don't know the whole story, we know 80% of the story, and that should be sufficient for people to get started.
And mechanisms like audits take a long time. We're looking in, again, back to AI and IT systems. We found Tesla, for instance, saying you should comply with our data reporting and, you know, AI interfaces. They didn't mention AI. They said the IT interfaces, and they don't give any details. And myself as an engineer, I'm saying this has no value to me, because you don't tell me. You have to disclose your interfaces if you want me to even try to comply. And that's not easily possible, right? And the same with Amazon and all the others.
Yeah,
So
but
there
that is
is
exactly where you would then have the disputes with those who are supposed to disclose their interfaces, and they say, no, we need it for the proper working.
exactly. There are our intellectual property and our crown jewels and all these good things. You again, I'm tempted to extend this conversation for at least another hour. But again, in the
we could
interest of
talk
time,
again if you have
I'll take
interest.
up the offer. Actually, we are actually considering how to put inside the AKFI task force exactly around these gaps in the supply chains. We, on the back of our white paper and our working group. So, very much invited already back. I'll go back to Isabella and you for the final question or questions.
I think Alexandra gave a very comprehensive and insightful answer to my wrap-up question in terms of the future of digital transformation and sustainability in general. I mean, the whole conversation, it's very insightful already to let us understand what's going on. Very detail-oriented. I really like those dates and what's really going on among the EU communities, and those are very, very helpful for us to understand the situation. So really appreciate for all the information, Alexandra. I'm surprised you share so much with us, and very excited to have you back with more updates and information to our audience.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Manu.
And lastly, and thank you again for taking the time, and thank you to all our audience for tuning in. Make sure to join us every week for a new episode of AKFI's Actionable ESG Talks series, where you can gain new perspectives on how to mitigate risks and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation. So until the next episode, goodbye for now, Manuel. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you, Isabella.
You,
Fascinating discussion. You put the future on the table already. Thank you.
Thank you.